It might be hard to believe, but New York City, there was one specific little creature that enjoyed and savored every last slurp. That is the oyster. Oysters, of course, are oysters, some of the best oysters. York Harbor and its waterways. Today we're going to learn about the man who's trying to bring back that oyster population, because there used to be up to 1 trillion oysters here in New York City. And the oysters act as a natural water filter, so they were filtering out all the waterways here in the city. But of course, due to overeating of the oysters in the 1800s and pollution from industry and manufacturing, the oyster population dwindled. I'm Ariel. This is Classic Harborline. Let me know where you're watching from. Right now, we are at the Kingston with Captain Shannon at the helm, and we have Sarah right over there, and we have Lower Manhattan here looking gorgeous today. So before we meet the man of the hour, of a little bit, take it in. I think it's very important to take in the views before we enjoy all this information and stories about bringing back oysters here in New York City. Look at that. Wow. So we're looking at Lower Manhattan with the Freedom Tower there. Let me know where you're watching from. And slam that like button right now so we can show people more places around the New York Harbor. Here in Classic Harbor Lines, they explore places all around the New York Harbor, show tourists and locals alike through a variety of different experiences, including jazz tours, dinner cruises, brunch cruises, architectural tours, military tours, the list goes on. It is amazing. Highly recommend it. And Mika says, wait, there are oysters in New York City? Yes, indeed there are. All right, let's go learn about oysters, shall we? And let me know if you're on Team Like. Hello.
Hi.
So here's Pete Malinowski. Pete, you're running a wonderful organization called Billion Oyster Project.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about the project.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to be with you here. Our Billion Oyster Project, we're a small nonprofit located on Governor's Island, and we're on a mission to restore 1 billion live oysters to New York Harbor and to engage 1 million New Yorkers in the work of restoring those oysters. So all of this used to be full of animals. If we were here 400 years ago, we wouldn't be able to see the sky because there were so many birds, and everywhere you looked on the water there would be fish.
Oh, wow.
This was once one of the most dynamic and productive ecosystems on the face of the earth. And we destroyed that by eating all the oysters and removing that critical habitat from the bottom of the harbor.
Oh, no.
So what we're trying to do at Billion Oyster Project is to start rebuilding some of that habitat.
Oh, that's great to hear. But first, before we go deeper into oysters, where are we heading to right now?
So right now we just went down the west side of Manhattan, and we're going to go around Governor's Island. And what you can see here, this is the Hudson River, and the East River, right? Manhattan, Brooklyn and Queens, Roosevelt Island, and this is all we would call the Upper New York Bay. So it's the center of New York Harbor, but it's not all of New York Harbor. There's a lot of New York Harbor south of here, and Jamaica Bay and Raritan Bay, and the harbor really goes north up to the Tappan Zee Bridge. This is the center of the harbor, though.
Oh, I see. All right, let's go to the bow to show more of the views. Hello, Joe. Hello, Jonathan says, wow, that is a lot of oysters. Indeed, soon there'll be billions, says Susie. Okay, so you're aiming for 1 billion oysters. What was the highest number that is known?
Way more than that. Many trillions of oysters.
Wow.
Just to put it in perspective, we're going to put 1 billion oysters on about 100 acres of New York Harbor bottom, and there used to be 200,000 acres of oyster reef in New York Harbor. Oh. So there's, the numbers are really astronomical for what used to be here.
Oh, fascinating. And would have the scenery looked different back then, the time during Henry Hudson and New Amsterdam, in terms of due to the oysters?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine it looking out here now, but you can imagine a really bucolic salt marsh, sort of rolling hills. The land was much smaller. 25% of the harbor's been filled with land. So you imagine a lot of soft shorelines.
Waterways going into
Waterways
Manhattan.
going into Manhattan, going into Brooklyn, and a lot of wetlands that aren't here anymore. And then the biggest difference, and the hardest thing to imagine, I think, is just the abundance of animals. There's nowhere on Earth more that has the abundance of animals that New York Harbor used to have. Yeah. So we can't see that. It's hard to imagine that, right? But the early colonists, when they arrived, wrote home and said, "We'll never need to go anywhere else for fish. There's more fish here than we could ever possibly eat."
That's funny. And there used to be oyster middens as well.
Right. So the Native Americans who lived here for thousands of years harvested oysters and built shell middens around the harbor.
So just a stack of oyster shells.
Big, huge piles of oyster shells.
Because they don't disintegrate that easily, right?
Yeah, they last for a long time, and that's you can see middens all up and down the East Coast. But New York's definitely a center.
Island playing into your project.
We're based on Governor's Island. That's our headquarters. We've been operating out of Governor's Island since 2010, and you can actually see the second building back right here is the New York Harbor School.
Oh, cool.
And the Urban Assembly Harbor School is the source of Billion Oyster Project. I'm a former harbor school teacher. Lessons, but also specialize in marine fields.
Yeah.
And Billion Oyster Project provides a platform for those students to practice the skills they're learning: driving boats, welding, designing experiments, designing reef structures, maintaining boats, and growing oysters. Those students are specializing in those different skills, and then they can practice those by working to restore oysters in New York Harbor.
And who's a part of the program? Who joins into the project?
We work with a lot of students, teachers and students, both at Harbor School and at about 100 other middle schools throughout the city.
Oh, wow.
We provide science equipment, a curriculum, and work with thousands of volunteers every year who come out to Governor's Island and help us build our reef structures and do our restoration work. Work with restaurants. 75 restaurants collect shells for Billion Oyster Project, and we bring those out to Governor's Island, use as reef structures. We want everyone in New York City to have a way to access restoring nature where they live.
Oh, yeah.
And the harbor is New York City's biggest open space, biggest and best looking open space, I would say.
Right.
It's totally underutilized today, like any other day. If you look around, there's practically no one out here, and it's this amazing space that we all have access to, and we should all think of as ours. And we think that engaging people directly in making it better is the best.
Oysters a little bit later, right?
Yeah, I think we will see some oysters over at Brooklyn Bridge Park. We go over there.
So for people who don't know anything about marine life, we have people tuning in from all around the world. What is an oyster?
Yeah, oysters are bivalve mollusks. They're, on one hand, not that interesting, but they do all of these amazing things. So it's sort of similar to a clam or a mussel or a scallop, that they have two shells and they're filter feeders. But what oysters do that are really unique to other bivalves is they build reefs. So they cement onto each other permanently and then don't move again for the rest of their lives. And that allows oyster reefs to grow over time into these big three-dimensional structures that provide food and habitat for hundreds of other species.
Oh, so they're three-dimensional. I'm popping up photos so people can see. They're three-dimensional. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So you can really think of oyster reefs as the coral reefs of temperate waters. Okay. They do all the same things that coral reefs do, except on a much more temperate estuaries are far more productive ecosystems than many tropical spaces. So an oyster reef in New York Harbor can add a lot more biomass to the ocean than a tropical coral reef. But I think it's helpful to think of the oyster reefs sort of like trees in a forest.
Right.
Because they provide similar ecosystem services, right? Trees make the air quality a little better, but they also stabilize the ground and provide habitat for a lot of animals and allow other plant species to thrive. And oysters are sort of the same. They're improving water quality, they're stabilizing the bottom, they're providing food and habitat for other animals. And so what we have here is essentially a clear-cut forest, right? It's a 200,000 acre space.
Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it.
That used to be this really dynamic, interesting ecosystem that's had all of its trees removed. And imagine if 30 million people lived lived around 200,000 acre forest that was totally underutilized, had been clear cut, was just a flat piece of dirt.
Yeah.
We would all be rushing to plant trees and restore nature. But because it's underwater, we don't think about the ecosystem the same way. So one of our goals at Billion Oyster Project is to daylight the ecosystem, is to draw attention to the fact that this is, even in its current state, it's a thriving ecosystem. And there's, in New York Harbor, you can find dolphins, occasionally whales, seahorses, anemones, all these different fish species, and it's really bouncing back in a really exciting way. But as New Yorkers, we don't think, despite the fact that most streets in New York end at the water's edge, we don't think about ourselves as living in a port city.
Yeah, exactly.
Or living, on a set of islands, or living surrounded by an important natural ecosystem.
Right.
So we leave New York City to find nature.
We forget that there's even water.
Right. And look, I mean, it's really spectacular out here.
And people are used to eating oysters today, what tends to be expensive restaurants, but that used to be very different. Do you think that will change moving forward with your project as well?
Well, our oysters are poisonous.
Okay.
You're not allowed to eat them.
Okay.
The quality in New York Harbor is still not up to a standard that allows for safe consumption of shellfish. So all of these waters are closed to shellfishing. It's unsafe to eat the oysters. They'd make you sick. And we really think that our oysters have a more important job to do than to be food.
Oh, interesting.
So
okay.
we're trying to restore them. That question, obviously oysters are food, but it would be sort of similar to asking a coral reef restoration project if we're ever going to eat the coral, right? So it's not,
right.
They have a more important job. But I think that,
So you're focusing more on kind of restoring the ecosystem.
Ecosystem services.
That's great.
Yeah. But oysters are obviously food, so it's a good question, and I think that oyster production is definitely increasing a lot. Most oysters are farmed now, so I don't know that it will ever be like it was, where you could buy a dozen oysters for a penny and everyone can eat as many oysters as they want. I think they're always, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe if we produce so many more that we get to that point, but. It's sort of a bummer because farmed oysters are the most sustainable form of protein production that exists. And so if we could figure out how to make them more accessible to everybody, we would be a good outcome for the planet generally. But they're pretty hard to grow, so they're going to remain pretty expensive. And wild oysters aren't really a thing anymore. Humans have eaten 95% of all the wild oysters in the world.
So are they extinct, or?
They're not extinct, but but it's the most impacted marine ecosystem on the planet. Almost completely gone. It went from being this, vital, really important keystone species all throughout the world to, all being eaten. So,
well, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of.
Well, I'm glad you guys are working on reviving the ecosystem. So, where are we approaching now?
So this is Governor's Island again, but what you can see in the distance here is our shell piles.
Oh, cool.
So we collect shells from about 75 restaurants.
And are those what would be called middens?
Well, it's a little different than a midden because a midden is specifically something that was put together a long time ago.
Okay.
But it's a similar idea. It's a giant pile of oyster shells.
Okay.
And they stay out here for a year or more so that any soft tissue degrades off the shells and any pathogens or animals from other places. And then after that, we put them in these big boxes, and then what you call gabions, and then get live oysters to attach to them, and then put them down on the bottom of the harbor.
Wait. So you're saying that these shells can be, in essence, recycled organically?
Yeah, they become part of our oyster reefs.
Wow.
And we need shells to do our oyster restoration.
That's fascinating.
Unfortunately, when we were harvesting oysters from New York Harbor, we didn't put the shells back. And oyster larvae need oyster shells, something similar to attach to grow their own shells. They're not using the shells for anything but an attachment point. But they need that in order to thrive in the wild. So without any shells on the bottom, there's nowhere for the oyster larvae to go.
And you have representatives there for people visiting, and they can ask questions?
Yep, Billion Oyster Project staff member. They're running a volunteer day today, so in a little later we'll have 20 or 30 volunteers out here working on the shell pile, getting our stuff ready.
Oh, that's great to hear.
Yeah.
It's also great that your organization is public facing as well.
Yeah.
So you also offer program's open to the public, right?
Right. So we have public volunteer days, a few days a week, and we encourage everyone to come out and help with that.
And what's the website that people will find?
BillionOysterProject.org.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
If anyone has any oyster-related questions, feel free to ask. Soon we're gonna go see some actual oysters very soon.
That's right.
So what else should we be seeing here, or what else is interesting about Governor's Island for the project?
We have our headquarters out here, but what's kind of interesting about this little waterway, that this is called Buttermilk Channel, because farmers in Brooklyn used to be able to walk at low tide. They could lead their cattle across Buttermilk Channel to graze on Governor's Island. But what happened when we hardened all the shorelines in New York is that the water started moving so fast through Buttermilk Channel that it dredged, it removed, now it's very deep. But it didn't used to be. It used to be exposed at low tide, like very shallow.
Does too many oysters pose a challenge for boats and vessels?
I guess sort of theoretically that if the harbor was as full of oysters as it used to be, then it would be a navigational hazard. You have to remember that the average depth of New York Harbor is only 12 feet, and the channels are dredged to 40 feet, and soon it'll be even deeper than that. So the vast majority of the harbor right now is inaccessible to commercial traffic. So there's a lot of shallow space in the harbor that's not used by anyone else. Hundreds, an incredible amount of underutilized land. The channels are really a small percentage of the harbor where the commercial traffic is actually going. So it's possible to restore a thriving oyster population back in New York Harbor without impacting any other users.
Oh, that's great to hear. And then where are the areas that you're bringing back oysters?
We have sites, so we've restored about 100 million oysters over the last 10 years at probably 18 different locations.
Wow.
Our biggest sites are at the mouth of the Bronx River, up in the Bronx, sort of western Long Island Sound, up that way, sort of in that direction, past Brooklyn and Queens. And then all the way up the Hudson River by the Tappan Zee Bridge, we have a big reef site. Along the west side of Manhattan in Hudson River Park, we have a few sites along the Brooklyn shoreline. And we're actually, next week, we're installing 20 million oysters in Jamaica Bay.
20 million?
Right by sort of near JFK Airport.
It's another area that's beautiful in New York City.
Beautiful. It's a 22,000 acre national park full of ospreys and all these cool wading birds and dolphins and fish that you can get to on the subway.
Oh, interesting. And as far as I know, oyster shells also used to be used for landfill and for concrete sidewalks.
Some buildings and streets are made of oyster shells. It's an additive, I guess.
Would there be a benefit to using it also for construction, or is that for far future? How would that work?
Yeah, maybe in the far future. It's actually the shell. It's not very convenient to collect shells from restaurants. It's actually pretty labor intensive, and there's a truck going around Manhattan and Brooklyn every day to collect all those shells. So it's not really. It's good for us because
it's
we need the
logistically
shells for a very specific application.
Yeah.
But there's other aggregate materials that would be easier to get
and are there other applications for the shells themselves?
People use them as a soil additive, change the pH of the soil and add calcium. Some people feed them to chickens, make the eggshells harder. And I don't know besides that.
So Oleg, tuning in from, and let's sit down again. Oleg, as we go deeper into Brooklyn, Oleg said oysters were primarily the food of poor people. Then they became popular among the rich.
Yeah. I think I should say that a primary source for what I'm going to say is Mark Kurlansky's book, The Big Oyster, which I highly recommend. But he describes everyone eating oysters, like rich and poor alike. There were fancy restaurants serving oysters, and you could buy them on the street corner for a penny for half a dozen. And so I think it was a real mix.
Right.
And New York City used to be famous for its oysters, so people would come to New York excited to try New York Harbor oysters.
Oh yeah,
and they were shipped all over the world.
And they got very big too.
Yes, the oysters will continue. They'll continue to grow for a very long time, so they can grow very big. And there's stories about oysters being 1.5 feet long.
Oh wow!
Coming out of the Gowanus Bay 400 years ago.
Which, according to Mark Clancy's book, there was a famous French chef who came over here and said the finest oysters were in the Gowanus.
Yeah.
And so how big have the oysters gotten in your project?
Oh, we have some oysters at some of our sites that are very big, that are, you know, like that, like the size of your foot.
I see.
Like, and they'll, you know, those are 5 or 6 or 7 years old, and then they'll keep growing. Oysters don't live. They can live for a very long time. Most of them don't live that long. But since we've been doing this for a long time, we've seen at some of our sites some of those really big oysters.
Bless you.
Excuse me.
Kay, Niels, and Joe says this information is blowing my mind. Indeed it is. It's blowing my mind too. And then traditionally, oysters were located everywhere along the harbor, or were they like hot spots for them natively?
Yeah, I think they were pretty much all of New York Harbor is an estuary, which means you have freshwater river meeting the ocean, and it's, you know, one of the, I'm obviously biased, but one of the great estuaries in the world, because you have the mighty Hudson River bringing all this nutrient-rich water down into the western North Atlantic, which is already a nutrient-rich place.
Oh yeah.
So you have all of this life happening. But oysters like estuaries. They're when there's a mix of salt and fresh water.
Oh yeah.
So according to Kurlansky and other accounts, the oysters were everywhere in the harbor. And you can see. I think we're not gonna poke in here, but you can see right now our aquaculture system. So those 4 tan containers with the white pipes going into them. You see that all right?
You're talking about the blue ones? I see the tan ones.
To the right of the blue ones. So
perfect.
Those are 20-foot open-top shipping containers that have been turned into oyster tanks. So we put steel floors in the bottom, steel bulkhead, painted them with food-grade epoxy paint, added plumbing and aeration systems, and
is this the one?
Heaters. Oh yeah, that's a great
cool.
picture.
Perfect.
Awesome. And right now, actually yesterday, we added 60 million tiny oysters to those tanks.
Oh wow.
And the hope is that they're also filled with shell and water, warm filtered seawater or harbor water, and the hope is that
it's kept warm.
Their preferred temperature is about 80 degrees, which is the temperature of New York Harbor in a couple months. So we're kind of simulating a later time in the season by warming the water up, and then the oyster larvae swim around, attached to those shells, and then on next week we'll actually come here with a barge, drain the water out of the tanks, and the oysters will be about the diameter of a pencil.
Let me show. How much?
Like a pencil diameter, right? Little
That's
tiny.
amazing. They're tiny. Wow.
And then the tanks will go onto a barge, fill them up with water, and then fill the tanks back up with water, and then the barge will go out to Jamaica Bay for the deployment, and then we'll pour all of the shells with the little tiny oysters on them out in the bottom at a reef site.
Very cool. Susie says, are we doing all well? Yeah. All right. I guess we can turn back to 115 as well. We could go to 115. Yeah. So we got a few questions. Oleg from Ukraine, Estonia, says, how do the oysters come with pearls inside?
Right. So these are Eastern oysters or American oysters, two names for the species. It's pretty uncommon for them to develop pearls. They're not a pearl oyster. Actually, most pearls come from a bivalve, not technically an oyster, but it's more closely related to a mussel. But you can get pearls in these, but it's really rare. Usually, it's not very common.
Interesting. And then the other question Susie has is oyster spats. I have no idea what that is. What is oyster spats? So,
spat is a term that's used to describe very young oysters that have attached to something. So what we're producing in these tanks, one way to describe it is to call it spat on shell. So you have the shells in the tank, and then you have 10 or 20 little tiny oysters on each shell, and that's spat on shell. So oyster spat describes a condition, a certain size, and a condition of oysters.
Is that good for them, or?
Yeah, it's what they do in the wild. They'll attach to something, and they stick on, they cement themselves to a substrate, go through metamorphosis, turn into what we think of as what you think of when you think of an oyster.
Wow, fascinating.
But the first 2
creatures.
weeks they're swimming around in the water.
They're swimming too.
Yep.
Oh, fascinating creatures.
They're very, very small at that point. 60 million oysters is about the same size as a tennis ball.
And Ron says, the world is your oyster. Indeed it is.
Thank you, Ron. Appreciate that.
And then the point of reference for most people, of course, is eating oysters. They're a single oyster. How do they get alone? Like, how do you get a single oyster?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the wild, oysters grow on reefs, so they all grow together, and they're shaped much differently than what you would think of as an oyster, because they kind of grow, they're very elongated and irregularly shaped because they're all growing in a big clump, big cluster on a reef. But the single oysters are and for anyone listening who's been to an oyster roast down in the Low Country in South Carolina and Georgia, those are wild oysters that are harvested off a reef, and they look much different. But half-shell oysters are grown specifically to as individuals for the restaurant plate. So they're broken apart when they're very young, or instead of attaching to a shell like we do ours, they'll attach to a powdered piece of oyster shell, so only one oyster attaches to each little shell fragment.
Oh, I see.
So you get
so that's more of the farming process. Yes. I see. And then the style you're doing is trying to recreate the wild process.
Exactly, yeah. So we're trying to simulate oyster reefs.
Fascinating. So 115 Marina, which we're heading to right now, what do you do? What's the programs at 115?
We're very fortunate to have some space at the Marina to grow oysters. We have an oyster nursery there, we have a small oyster reef, and we also work together with the Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy, which is a nonprofit that's located in Brooklyn Bridge Park and also does a lot of educational programming. And we call this site in Brooklyn Park one of our field stations.
Okay.
So we have a bunch of sites throughout the waterfront, all around the city that we call field stations, and it's a concentration of some of our different types of work in one place. So we have some oyster research stations here, we have an oyster nursery and a small oyster reef, and it becomes a place where community members, school groups, volunteers can access the restoration work we're doing at a site close to their home.
Oh, that's good to hear. And Doreen says, I love oysters.
Me too, Doreen.
Well, actually, what got you into this project personally?
My parents. So I grew up on the Fishers Island Oyster Farm. It's a small family farm, Fishers Island, New York, east of Long Island. And so I've actually, at no point in my life have I not been working with oysters.
Oh, cool.
So I grew up with 5 siblings, and we all worked on the farm at different times.
So you've been learning about it since a little kid.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And why New York City? For yourself personally?
Well, I am definitely a bunch of different reasons. So that the fascinating thing about doing this work in New York City is that there's so much that's cool about it. You have this huge density of people living around a natural space that used to be like one of the great ecological gems of the world.
Right.
And in New York City is so great. There's not a lot of places like that where you have sort of completely destroyed a natural ecosystem, but you have the ability to restore it. So that's very exciting about doing it in the city. There are 22 of the it's the world having this urban environment around what used to be a very productive natural space, and all around the world, as we clean up the waterways in cities like New York, there's potential to get a resurgence in wildlife. And we've really seen that in New York just in the last 15 years. That's how long I've been doing this work. There's been a dramatic change in the abundance and diversity of animals because back in the 60s and early 70s, the water quality was so bad that it sort of hit a valley. And now the water quality is a lot better. The animals are coming back. So now New York Harbor is a place where you can find seahorses, anemones, dolphins, seals, all kinds of cool birds. You see skimmers, wading birds, ospreys, kingfishers. It's really it's quickly becoming this really cool natural space again.
Because those animals live next to the oyster reefs.
Yeah, sure. I mean, because they live in the harbor,
Oh,
and
in the harbor.
they benefit from some of them benefit from the oyster reefs, but we all benefit from cleaning up New York Harbor, which has happened in a really dramatic way over the last 50 years.
Oh, that's amazing.
And so the harbor, if you ask the average New Yorker, whether or not they'd go swimming in the East River, they'd say, no, that's disgusting, it's polluted, it's a toxic waste dump. But the reality is the East River is one of the cleanest water bodies in New York City.
Really?
It's safe to, it's by EPA standards, safe to swim in most days of the year.
Okay.
If it was a beach, it would be open. It's a beautiful place.
Oh,
There's
right.
nothing, and so
And there are beaches in Williamsburg, for example.
there are beaches, and it's that that perception of the harbor as a toxic, polluted place is a legacy from 100 years of crazy pollution when it was. It smelled bad and looked bad and was an off-putting thing to be around. But now it's really it's cleaned up so much that we should be taking better advantage of the resource.
So we have a lot of questions that are very interesting. Let's do a rapid fire. Freddie says, do oysters sequester industrial waste, PCBs? Not sure what that means, but
yeah. So oysters bioaccumulate toxins just like any other animal that lives in the water. So they do sequester heavy metals, and all of that, PCBs, and but if they, as long as they remain in the harbor, those toxins remain inside them. So they're sequestering them, but you're not removing them from the system.
Okay.
The biggest water quality improvement is they can mitigate nitrogen pollution. Just the biggest pollutant in all coastal environments is nitrogen, fertilizer that comes in through our treated wastewater, and agricultural runoff and lawn fertilizer. And that causes an imbalance in nutrients, and which can cause hypoxia and dead zones. And oysters, through their feeding, can really mitigate that and help reduce the nitrogen concentration in the water.
And speaking of fertilizer, Long Island has a huge problem with fertilizer.
Yeah.
And someone asked, let's see, who was it? Joe asked, why does Long Island have a place called Oyster Bay?
Because it used to be full of oysters.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so Long Island also had oysters along its waterfront.
All the bays on the south side of Long Island and in Long Island Sound used to be full of oysters.
And Oleg says, why is it always served raw? Why isn't it cooked? Usually, at least nowadays. That's what Oleg asks.
Well, I think it depends on where you live.
Okay.
In New York City, the market is entirely dominated by the half-shell market, and everyone's eating them raw.
Yeah.
There's very little cooked oysters. There's some, but it's it's rare. Down south, oyster po' boys, fried oysters, oyster roasts are all really common. So I think it depends on Oyster Rockefeller. Depends on where you are.
Right. And I'm voting to bring back oyster pies.
Oyster pies. I've never had them. I'm looking forward to my first oyster
Yeah,
pie.
exactly. All right, so now we're going to 115. So excited to see some oysters if we're able to.
Yeah, we can pull up some oysters.
And then we'll chat a little bit more how it's made it, how you guys capture these oysters and help them grow. Oleg says, wow, good progress. Yeah. Craig says, oysters are usually a good indicator of water quality. Elizabeth has another great question. Can you explain the high and low tides of places like Well,
there's a few things that affect the tide. There's a lot of things that affect the tide, but the latitude is a big thing.
No, but what affects the taste of the oyster?
The taste of the oysters?
Yeah.
So oysters taste like the water they come from, and the flavor of that is affected by the minerals around the coast, the human impacts, a million different things. The amount of time they spend in the water, whether they're intertidal or subtidal. So you can really think of oyster flavor a lot like wine, in that every specific location is going to have a much different flavor profile just based on the geological conditions near the site.
Hence why they're usually served with wine.
Yeah, and they're just as different. So an oyster from one bay over can taste completely different based on the conditions at that site. And
what's next after, you get 1 billion oysters in New York? What's next?
Well, I think that we've restored 100 million oysters. We have 900 million to go, so we have a lot of growing to do here in New York.
I mean, but there's a rate that it's exponential or near exponential, right, with oysters?
Well, we only count the ones that we put in the water.
Okay.
So but we're trying to grow our production, not really exponentially, but we're trying to get to 100 million oysters per year, and once we've restored 100 million oysters, there will still be a great need to get more oysters in New York Harbor and continue to connect people to the local environment. But I also think that just demonstrating that we can do that here in New York, in one of the greatest cities, if not the greatest city in the world, then we really, have demonstrated that cities anywhere can have a similar type of project, restore the natural environment in the city, and go from being a city that is scared of the harbor to a city that really actively uses, cares for, and protects and preserves the natural resource.
Exactly, yeah. And Dutch Moz, who's tuning in, who's another live streamer, he says, you guys are doing excellent work.
Well, thank you so much.
Keeping New York City clean. And would this also affect the beach areas in southern Queens, for example, in southern Brooklyn? Or not yet?
Well, I think that one of my great hopes in doing this kind of work is that New Yorkers wake up one day and decide it's no longer acceptable to pour raw sewage into our natural ecosystem, and we decide as a community to stop allowing that.
Yeah.
So right now the harbor is swimmable and fishable most days of the year. When it rains, hundreds of millions of gallons of raw sewage pour into the harbor. It does not need to be that way. We have the technology and the ability to stop that from happening if we have the collective will to stop it from happening. And so that could have a really positive impact on the water quality in the Rockaways and at those beaches. The main thing polluting the water there, and the water there is much cleaner than it is even in New York Harbor, so it's safe to swim all the time. But the anything that affects water quality at those sites is coming from the harbor. So if we decide one day as a community to stop pouring raw sewage on our natural ecosystem, then that would be amazing for New York Harbor and for the beaches of southern Queens and for Long Island Sound and for all of that. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. And then Susie says, makes me proud of the East River, indeed. Yeah. And Freddie says, do mussels compete with oysters?
Mussels do a lot of the same things. They filter the water. They can actually survive in some places that oysters can't. Rib mussels can handle worse water quality than oysters. So but their lifestyles are pretty different. Mussels move around and attach to structures, and can relocate themselves. And oysters are reef buildings. So they're sort of occupy different areas of the ecosystem.
All right, let me show a little bit of the views as we're waiting to get aboard. So right here we see Brooklyn Heights. That is the BQE with the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. And this entire area, massive reef. Waterfowl is returning, right? Which is great.
And we actually have a little oyster reef. We call it at this field station where you can walk down into the water and around this corner. You can't see much. Well, we could probably see a little bit if we got close and looked into the water there. But we have a set of reef structures that goes around this edge, and we're working over the next couple of years to really expand that a lot.
Oh, that's cool. It's so close to the waterfront that people can almost see it.
Yeah.
And do they help prevent floods as well, or overflow of water?
Yeah. Thank you so much. So, oyster reefs historically played that role in a huge way. Protected the.
Are we good? All right, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So yeah, you can look at the sediment in different places in New York City. Staten Island's a good example.
Yeah.
And you can, looking back in time by looking at the sediment, by digging, taking sediment cores, and you can see every major storm event that hit Staten Island. Because when there's a major storm event, sediment from under Raritan Bay gets pushed up onto the shore. And that signal stops 400 years ago, 500 years ago. Because when Raritan Bay was full of oyster reefs, that didn't happen. The oysters broke all the storm waves, and so there weren't these waves pushing up onto the land, because oyster reefs were playing that role as a big breakwater and calming the water in Raritan Bay. And so oyster reefs definitely can play that role and can be part of a solution, sort of an integrated solution to rising water levels and more intense storms. They're not going to, oyster reefs on their own are not going to keep the water from rising in New York City.
Yeah, of course.
There's a lot that needs to happen, but they can definitely be part of the solution.
That's great. All right, lead the way.
Let's see. I don't know if we'll be able to see.
And let me clip this on you so it'll be a little bit easier for you to. So here, just clip that way. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Like that.
Awesome.
There we go. So I don't know if we'll be able to see. The water's kind of murky, but you can kind of see an edge of one there. There's a set of reef structures that comes around this corner.
That's really the only one you can see well. I'm sure you can't.
Will you be able to?
Well, so we can look at the ones over here. We
Okay,
have
let's do it.
some oyster cages over here. We have two different things going on here. There's an oyster reef on this side and an oyster nursery right here. The nursery is set up to be more accessible. These cages are very heavy. I'm going to see if I can pull one of these up, but it should be easier to.
Let's. So one more time, this is Pete Malinowski of Billion Oyster Project. And his work may one day unleash a billion-dollar industry here in New York City. So he's pulling an oyster nursery right now. Oh, yeah. Doreen says, are we going to sample? I don't think we're going to sample. We're going to definitely...
Oysters are friends, not food.
There we go, precisely. That is awesome. So what are we looking at?
So this is just a regular, this is a pretty common way to grow oysters. It's called spat cage. And they, we hold oysters here to be as an experiment, see how well they grow, see whether or not they reproduce, and most importantly, see if we attract any young oysters to the site. So you can see inside there's a bunch of oysters, and also, I mean, they're not, usually we'd actually get a lot more animals, so maybe we should try to pull up one of the big cages to help me. You get a better view at some critters.
Yeah, I'll pull it out with him. Yeah, that would be great.
They're pretty heavy, but I think we can do it. Might be a little more exciting.
Okay.
So you're gonna grab that, and we'll stand up and move down a little bit so we get past this cleat.
Okay.
And then you want to reach down as far as you can to like here. And then 1, 2, 3.
All right. Wow.
So these.
That's cool. I'm officially an Oyster Man. Is that the title of what people used to
Oyster
work
Man,
with
sure.
oysters?
Baymen, Oyster Man.
Thank you so much.
Here you go. For you. Or you just give that to you.
Oh, and who's this guy? What?
Little cunner.
What?
Little cunner, little fish.
He's still alive.
Still alive, so we'll let him go.
Yeah, let's free him back.
But that's what you see. The oyster cages kind of quickly become a center for biodiversity, and we see that at all of our reef sites. Just a few weeks after putting oysters on the bottom, you get this real concentration of all these different animals.
What are we seeing any other animals at the moment?
There's not a lot going on right here, but we just have some different species of algae and mostly oysters, and some other.
What are these? Are these like new?
Well, no, these are oysters that have just grown through the mesh of the cage.
They're trying to get out?
They're trying to get out, yeah.
Do they grow on the cage as well?
So, yeah, it's.
Sorry about this. No worries.
Yeah, so oyster larvae in the system will swim around and occasionally set on these cages, and then there'll be a wild oyster on the cage.
Oleg says, how much does one cage cost?
Well, these are very kindly donated by the company that makes them.
Beautiful.
You got another fish? Well, let's get him out of there. That's a little blackfish. Blackfish eat oysters.
Oh, they eat oysters, huh?
I mean, not when they're that size.
Oh, that's so cute. Oh, awesome. I love that. Do these oysters ever move? You said they swim when they're young.
Well, actually, you do have some anemones right here. They're all closed up. Okay. But those are anemones that would open up in the water.
What is that?
An anemone, they're like little, they have tentacles, sort of like upside down jellyfish. And that's what that is right there too. And a little polychaete worm. So you have some stuff here. There's a mussel, a couple mussels. Right there.
It's an entire seafood feast.
Yeah.
I didn't see them. All right, cool. And then do these get bigger?
They'll keep growing, and this because it's an oyster nursery. The goal is just to leave them here, and we'll come back and monitor them from time to time, see see what percentage of them survive, whether or not they're reproducing, and whether or not new oysters are coming to the site. And that's the big. Right. So this is kind of like an ongoing experiment, and we do that with volunteers and ambassadors. Ambassadors are individuals who have volunteered multiple times who want to play. Want to get more deeply involved, so we rely on our ambassadors to do a lot of the monitoring at these sites, and it's definitely a cool way to get involved if you're into it.
That's amazing. Wow. Thank you so much for showing this
of course.
To all of us here. One more time, where can people find more about the Billion Oyster Project?
BillionOysterProject.org. Follow our Billion Oyster at on various social channels, and then BillionOysterProject.org.
Any events coming up in the immediate future?
Well, we just launched. We're doing an oyster social at Gage and Tollner that next week, or in 2 weeks, that I may already be sold out. And then our biggest event is our Oyster Bash on September 22nd, which will be in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We'll have 50 oyster farms, 30 restaurant partners, a couple thousand people, live music. It's very, very fun. So everyone should come to that.
That's amazing. Wow. Thank you everyone so much for tuning in. If you want to see my own videos, you can go to Urbanist Exploring Cities on YouTube, Urbanist Live on Instagram, and also go to classicharborline.com to learn all about their tours. Thank you so much, Pete. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Everyone,
thanks for joining.
Stay curious, my friends. Have a great day. Bye-bye.